Thank you for coming tonight. My name is Carol Rainier Oakray. I am John and Eva Mae Rainier's youngest daughter. My dad has shared his World War II experiences and pictures with hundreds of people over the years, probably thousands. The groups have ranged from an auditorium filled with high school students to friends who stop in for coffee and wind up in his basement amongst his wartime memorabilia. Dad's experiences and pictures are an important part of our history that we don't want to lose when he's not around to tell them. So with the expertise of our sound folks, Joseph and Susan, and the people up in the booth up there, we are recording the presentation this evening and will be able to produce DVDs. I would like to thank everyone who has helped to promote this event this evening, and a special thank you to all the veterans as we recognize Veterans Day today. It is my honor to introduce my dad, John Rainier.
Well, thank you, Carol, and thank you very much. This is the biggest group I've ever talked to, I think, since I retired from Century years ago. I have, as Carol said, after I retired in 1984, and the 50th anniversary of D-Day was observed several years later. World War II memories of the veterans that we were a part of really started in full fury with Stephen Ambrose's book and Studs Terkel's book and The Greatest Generation book. So this seemed to trigger an awful lot of interest in World War II history. And I had had some rather unique experiences as far as the learning quite a bit about the horrible slave labor camps that the Nazi system had built and managed. And so I put my old slides together, and with the help of a lot of friends and stuff, I've had a show that I have given many times. But I just have to beg your understanding of sitting while I talk. I've decided that after reaching my 91st birthday a few days ago, I've talked better when I'm sitting than standing. So bear with me. Just a little background. I'm from Minnesota originally, and I went into the service right after my 21st birthday in December of 1942. I had the honor of going in just before Christmas in 1942. I was inducted at Fort Snelling in St. Paul, Minnesota, and ended up being quite fortunate after a lot of testing and processing that we did there. There were a group of us that went in at that time that were assigned to a newly formed medical regiment in a new camp in Mississippi. After moving south for the first time in my life, went through basic training in Mississippi. Then we moved to another camp in Tennessee, played war in the hills of Tennessee for a couple of months in the summer, and ended up being processed for overseas in 1944, shortly after D-Day. I ended up in a medical battalion headquarters unit, and our mission was to provide ambulance support and medical evacuation for infantry units in combat. But we ended up going to England in the summer of 1944, shortly after D-Day, and after processing in Camp Shanks, New York, we sailed to Europe in a armada of about 50 ships. And spent 3 weeks in England getting our equipment, our vehicles, and all our supplies, and landed in Normandy right after Normandy was liberated. So we spent several days in Normandy getting oriented to the situation there, and it was totally destroyed. Of course, all the towns, and there had been tremendous fighting there for several weeks before, after D-Day. We joined the war in the Battle of Northern France, the old World War I area of France, where the Germans had dug in the old Maginot Lines. After World War I, of course, the French built the Maginot Line fortifications to try and keep the Germans out of France in the future, and the Germans built the Siegfried Line across the German border to keep the French out of Germany. But of course, they hadn't been able to predict the very radical change in armored warfare that happened after World War I. But the Germans were extremely dug in northern France. That was the last barrier they were able to occupy before their country was invaded. So Third Army, we were assigned to Patton's Third Army after we got to England, and they had the mission of driving the Germans out of northern France and taking the rest of, then preparing for the invasion of Germany itself. So the casualties were very heavy at that time, so our medical headquarters unit was temporarily assigned as extra help in a MASH-type field hospital right behind the front lines in northern France. So this was not the type thing we had expected to be involved with, but they needed all the, casualties were very heavy at that time. They were doing from 100 to 150 surgeries every 24 hours. And I ended up being assigned as extra help in the surgery section. Remember, there was two big ward tents with 4 tables in each of the tent, and a dressing and sterilization tent attached to it to prepare the surgical packs and all the stuff that had to be brought in and out of surgery. So this was quite a new experience, of course, but I want to give this a little bit of background because this was a rather shocking experience to start dealing with American casualties. They were bringing in tremendous numbers of young Americans, that everything from a simple bullet wound to a lot of brain injuries, spinal injuries, a lot of amputations. And so we worked 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week. 1 week days from 6 in the morning to 6 at night. The next week we worked nights from 6 at night to 6 in the morning, 7 days a week. So this was quite a shocking experience to be going through in context with this wasn't really the way we had been trained. But I learned an awful lot in doing that, and I had never heard the term SS as far as German military. But the night that Third Army finally completed the conquering of the old Maginot Line fort area in northern France and took the rest of northern France under American control, they found in the Maginot Line forts an awful lot of German casualties that had had little or no medical experience or medical care. So I happened to be working nights when a convoy of American ambulances brought in a large group of these German casualties from the forts. I remember being in one of the surgery tents about 1 o'clock in the morning when a young 22-year-old German SS officer was brought in, put on one of the tables. He had had his right arm blown off at the shoulder sometime before this. It was badly infected, and he was still conscious, but in very bad shape. And the surgeon and technician came in, the surgeon took a look at the vital signs that were read in the ambulance on the way down, and he told the technician supporting him, he said, if we have any chance of saving this guy, he's going to need whole blood and need it fast. And this young man feebly raised his left arm. He spoke English, and he says, what kind of blood is it going to be? And the surgeon said, well, it'll be the right type of blood. What's the problem? He says, well, if it's Jew or Negro blood, I don't want it. And this was the first shocking experience I had as to the degree of fanaticism that these men were trained with. The surgeon put the cover over him. He said, take this man off the table. There are men waiting that want to live more than he does. So he was taken out of surgery, and I never did know what happened to him after that, but I suspect he died that night. But this was, I had never heard the term SS before, but this was, I couldn't comprehend the degree of racial and religious fanaticism that these people were brought up with. Well, I give this background in context with the first pictures I have to show you. We of course, we went through, after the battle in northern France, we got our regular assignment to be the medical support for the 4th Armored Division in the 3rd Army. And we were in Metz, France, northern France, being prepared for the invasion of Germany, getting our supplies and so forth together. And when the second or third night we were in Metz, orders came through that the Germans had mounted their last big offensives in Belgium, which later became the Battle of the Bulge, when the largest armored and military manpower assault German had mounted since the D-Day invasion in Normandy. They were attempting to retake Belgium and get the port of Antwerp, which had been the key port of entry for all the supplies and stuff that was coming into Europe at that time. But fortunately, Third Army got orders early in the night that this war had broken out in Belgium, and our orders were changed. Rather than being the first army to invade Germany itself, we were moved up into Belgium to attempt to. Bastogne had been cut off, as you probably remember from World War II history. The 101st Airborne was in Bastogne. They were cut off totally for several weeks, and the German offensive was in full force, moving on beyond Bastogne. But we left northern France in the middle of the night in convoys. Every road in northern France was bumper to bumper with convoys. Third Army moved about 100,000 troops in 24 hours up into Luxembourg and Belgium. That was the first time we had seen General Patton when we came. 2 or 3 smaller highways converged into a larger one just before getting into Luxembourg, and he was out in the middle of the road during the night directing traffic through that intersection. But of course, we got our convoy through there and ended up setting up our quarters just south of Bastogne. And that was, the SS had really, there'd been tremendous numbers of American casualties in and around Bastogne before it was fully occupied by the Germans. And there were many SS troops behind our lines. They had taken uniforms from dead GIs and camouflaged themselves as Americans, and we were on those first 10 days or so after we moved up into Belgium. We were on high alert night and day because there was a lot of SS troops behind our lines camouflaged with American uniforms. After that, we finally retook Bastogne and retook the rest of Belgium and got the Germans driven back into their country. Most costly land battle of World War II for America, in that we had 18,000 killed, about 40,000 wounded American soldiers, and there were 16,000 to 18,000 Americans taken prisoner by the Germans. So this was a terrible. Of course, no one ever knew the total German casualties, but it was estimated that they lost about 100,000 men in this battle. But after that, we moved on into Germany itself and quickly realized that we were no longer the liberators as we had been treated in France and Luxembourg and Belgium, but we were now the conquerors. So even though the German military had moved rather rapidly up to the Rhine River line to try and keep the war stopped as long as they could from crossing the Rhine. But we finally got across the Rhine and deeper into Germany, and there the war had, the fighting had changed rather radically, in that the regular German troops in their army units were surrendering quite readily when they were confronted with a large onslaught of American military. But the biggest problems we had was with the SS troops behind our lines after we crossed the Rhine, because they would never surrender. They either had to be killed or physically taken prisoner. The first pictures I have to show you are of a Hitler youth camp. As you remember from World War II history, Hitler came to power in 1932, and they quickly installed their tremendous dictatorial Nazi system throughout the country, where they set up slave labor camps quite early in their reign to enslave anyone that wasn't pure Aryan, that might cause problems, or people that were handicapped or not getting along very well in society. And all the Jewish people, of course, they were rounding up Jewish people and sending them to these slave labor camps. This set of pictures is of the Hitler Youth School. This became the Hitler Jugend. And boys, this became a real honor to be able to have their kids accepted in these schools. And this was a set of pictures I found in Germany after the war ended and we were in occupation duty, that of a Hitler Youth School in southwestern Germany, quite close to the Swiss border. They had tremendous facilities. This is one of the barracks, soccer stadium, classroom at school, swimming pool. The Germans had excellent facilities. The instructors are all SS people. They started, this was the age that they started them, just young Cub Scouts. This picture is of our battalion crossing the Rhine. The Germans had blown up most of the bridges on the Rhine, trying to stop the American offensive as much as they could. But fortunately, our Army engineers were tremendous construction people who, after a bridge was blown up, they quickly built pontoon bridges, and we crossed the Rhine in late March of 1945. Several days after crossing the Rhine, this was in early April, our battalion convoy, led by our colonel's jeep, came into this little town of Ohrdruf, Germany. After we drove through the small town, Colonel Sanford took note of an assemblage of American soldiers in a field across from the highway, and so he pulled off to see what was going on, and learned that General Eisenhower, Patton, and Bradley had arrived just before we came into the town to go through the first slave labor camp the American armies had liberated. We hadn't really heard anything about concentration camps prior to this. The intelligence people, I'm sure, knew knew some about the slave labor program, but we had never heard anything about this in our training or in the war up to this point. But this, our battalion commander pulled our convoy off the highway, and we joined a group of 150 plus or minus soldiers that came on the scene about the same time as the high command came to go through this camp. So General Eisenhower, one of his staff people, announced to our group that we're going to be going through this camp. He said, if anybody has cameras, the general suggests that you take all the pictures you can, because he wants the world to know what we're seeing. Cameras were quite plentiful in Germany, and there were a lot of GIs that had liberated cameras along the way. And my very good friend that we met in basic training back in 1942 and were together all through the war, he had a camera that carried in his duffel bag, and so the two of us take the pictures that you'll be seeing now. This first one is of General Eisenhower. Here's General Patton with his Colt Folder 5 on each hip. This particular camp, by the way, was an overflow camp for Buchenwald, and it had been liberated by the 4th Army Division, our support division. That's what brought us into the area, because we were following the 4th Army Division as they liberated this camp a few days before we got there, and actually there was very little left to liberate, in that the Hitler's high command apparently had given orders to the SS officers that ran these camps that before the Americans and British advanced to get to these camps, they wanted the evidence eliminated as much as they possibly could. Well, they succeeded at Ohrdruf in killing about 3,500 of the poor slave laborers before the camp was overrun by the Americans, and there were less than 100 living that survived the ordeal. There were some that had been in the camp a relatively short time and were still in pretty good health, that when they realized what was happening, they hid out under barracks and out in the woods, and then some of them just took off to the west where the Americans were occupying the area, but there were still a half dozen or so that had stayed around that were there when the generals came to go through the camp. And these were the three that turned out to be the most involved as tour guides for us, and that happened to be Russian Jewish people that had been shipped back into Germany from when the Germans were fighting in Russia. And there had been a lot of Russian military prisoners that were shipped back to Russia and put in slave labor camps. There were any Russian Jews were shipped back to put in concentration camps. General Eisenhower had his Russian interpreter with him, so he interviewed. These first pictures we took were of the preparation before going through the camp. Well, this rod on Eisenhower's Jeep, just want to say a word about that. After we crossed the Rhine, we quickly learned that there were many SS troops behind our lines, and they would string barbed wires across highways. Most of the convoys were driving at night, blackout driving, and there was the lead Jeep had little blue lights on the front bumper, but the visibility was rather poor, and they were leading the convoy of no lighted vehicles. And so what was happening, the Jeep drivers would quite typically lower their windshield at night where they had a little better visibility to see where they were going. And there were SS troops behind our lines that were stringing barbed wire across highways, and there were several Jeep drivers injured badly and killed through these barbed wire strung highways. So Eisenhower's headquarters put out orders to all the Third Army units that motor pools were to weld a steel rod to the front bumper of all Jeeps to break these barbed wire across highways for night driving. So our motor pool in our battalion had done that with all the Jeeps in our unit, of course, and this was Eisenhower's Jeep had his on it. You'll notice on the front bumper the Jeep the 5 stars. General Eisenhower was one of he and General Marshall and MacArthur were made 5-star generals, the first and the last military of that rank we've had. This was the MP Jeep that was escorting General Eisenhower's group. This was Eisenhower, General Bradley, and the man with the back to us was General Walker. He was the commanding general of the 20th Corps. And later on, unfortunately, he was the first and highest ranking general killed in the Korean War. Yeah, here's a good picture of General Patton and General Bradley. General Eisenhower was on the far left of the picture with part of his back to us. And the man without a helmet next to him was his Russian interpreter. This is a good picture of General Eisenhower. This was the kind of the lead survivor that turned out to be the tour guide. This was one of they would lay some of the laborers across that rod and strap them down and beat them. This is what we saw. The grounds are littered with dead. Here again, these poor people had been machine gunned. There was over 3,500 of them killed. Many of them were still out on the grounds. But there was three big mass graves. This was one of the mass graves. There were three. This is pretty standard. Of course, initially they intended to, in the gas ovens, cremate all the dead, but near the end of the war, they were so starved and beaten, these poor people, they were dying and being killed so fast that they couldn't keep up with the cremation, so they had mass graves. I'll never forget this scene. This was the body shed at the crematorium in Ohrdruf. I'll never forget, we took this picture about 15 or 20 feet behind General Patton and General Eisenhower when the MP opened this body shed. And I'll never forget Eisenhower's comment was, "This is the damnedest thing I've seen in all my life." And Patton's comment was, "The dirty German sons of bitches." I always remember that, and couldn't comprehend the slaughter of people that these bodies were stacked up for cremation. But they had three mass graves with, we were told that this was a pretty standard design in the slave labor camps toward the end of the war, where they were dying and being killed so fast that they would dig a big mass grave, and there was 600 to 800 bodies in each grave. There were also makeshift cremation pyres on the grounds where they had put steel rails piled over logs and then stacked the bodies on the rails and threw gasoline on the whole works and set it on fire. This was an effort to try to eliminate as much of the evidence as they could, but fortunately the 4th Armored Division got there before they succeeded in completing their task of totally eliminating the evidence. Now, this picture, there's a story behind this. We took our roll of film. The pictures you've just seen were taken by my friend Fred Kurtzville and I as we went through Ohrdruf. A few days later, we were much deeper into Eastern Germany, and of course, we had this roll of film that we were quite anxious to try and get developed sometime, but we didn't know when and if we could. But we came into a little village deep into Germany, and we're going to bivouac for the night. So as we came through the business section of the town was probably a half a dozen storefronts, and we noticed what appeared to be a little photo shop on the street. So we decided that after getting set up for the night, we'd go down and see if we could get in that shop and figure out a way to develop our roll of film. Well, we did this later in the evening and really lucked out. As we came in near the little shop, we noticed it was lit up and went in and discovered that there was a sergeant photographer from the 3rd Army Signal Photo Unit that was in there developing concentration camp pictures that he had been at Ohrdruf and had some of the same type pictures we had from Ohrdruf, but Buchenwald, one of the major camps, was liberated right after Ohrdruf, and he had been there and taken a lot of pictures. He had been assigned to take pictures of many of the slave labor camps that were being opened up and liberated after we got deep into Germany. And so he had many pictures. He helped us develop our roll of film, and and he offered me a set of the pictures he had up to that point of the other slave labor camps, including Ohrdruf and Buchenwald. And the next pictures you will see after this are of the pictures this Third Army photographer gave us. But this particular picture, after he helped us develop our roll of film and gave me a set of the pictures he had up to that time, he took out of his shirt pocket, he said, "Now I'll show you the most unusual picture I've ever been asked to take." And it was this picture of General Patton. He had been, his unit at Third Army headquarters had a request to send a photographer to report to General Patton at the Rhine River. This was several days before this, of course, that when we saw him. And he got to the Rhine and discovered, General Patton informed him, he said, "I've made a bet with my fellow generals that I was going to be the first American general to piss in the Rhine, and I want a picture of it to make sure I prove my bet." So this was the picture he took Patton to prove his bet with his fellow generals. And I regret it for years that I hadn't tried to make a deal with him to get a copy of that picture. But a few years ago, when Ken Burns made his series of World War II films for public television, and in context with that, co-authored a book about World War II. Well, our son Greg, who's in the audience here tonight, called me. Of course, Greg bought the book of Ken Burns right after it was published, and he said, "Dad, look on page 368 or something, and you'll find the picture you always wanted." And Ken Burns had obviously gotten this out of the Pentagon someplace. And so I find now we've photocopied from Ken Burns' book, so I finally have his picture. That's the story behind that one. It's pretty hard to quote or talk about General Patton without using barracks language. Now these pictures are the ones that the Army photographer gave me. These first ones are of Ohrdruf. He had some of the same pictures we had, a little different view. Now, before we left Ohrdruf, General Eisenhower, we heard him give orders to Patton and Bradley. He said, "As these camps are overrun, I want an infantry regiment assigned to the area, and I want any furniture manufacturers or any woodworking places put under the direction of the military government to have them make pine boxes, coffins, and I want the all able-bodied civilians rounded up, living in and near these camps, into work gangs to dig up the mass graves and recover as many individual bodies as can be recovered. And I want cemeteries made in and near these camps as a lasting monument to Nazism." And he said, "If the civilians resist, put a gun in their back. In other words, force them to do it." So this became the model, and the Third Army photographer had several pictures of funeral processions that he had witnessed. This was a picture from Buchenwald. This was the typical barracks that those poor people lived in. Wood bunks about 2 feet apart, 4 or 5 layers, 4, 5, 6 people in each filthy nest of the most unsanitary conditions you could ever imagine. It was just terrible. They literally worked and starved those people to death. This was a tattoo. This was in a SS officer's office at Buchenwald, and they found that he had taken a tattoo from the skin of one of the slave laborers and had it incorporated into a lampshade for his desk. This was a Jewish women's camp in the northern part of Germany that this photographer had been to. These were all Jewish women slave laborers that had been killed. And this was one of the civilian work groups digging up a mass grave. Here was another big group of German civilians preparing bodies for burial. This was the type coffins Eisenhower ordered made. This was a camp near Nuremberg. There was a funeral procession. Then we got very deep into Eastern Germany, quite close to the area where the Americans finally met the Russians. Our orders were changed, and our part of Third Army was moved south into Germany to be a part of the invasion of Austria from southern Germany. So this was quite near the end of April, of course, and the Germans, the regular German military was surrendering very easily, and but the only holdouts were the SS that were scattered around the area, and they were, of course, many of them invited being shot when they were discovered. So we heard Patton. Before we left order, Patton rounded up all of us that had gone through the camp, and he said, "You've seen what the bastards are doing." He says, "Don't worry about taking prisoners that are guarding these camps. Kill the bastards." And he was just roaring away. We ended up just before VE Day in a little town of Ried, Austria, north of Salzburg, beautiful part of the world. VE Day was May 8th, 1945, and we had the experience of the Russians brought in a bunch of about 200 German prisoners from the Russians were occupying the eastern part of Austria, and the Americans were responsible for the western part as far as occupied country. And they brought in about 200 German prisoners that they wanted to get rid of. Fortunately, they didn't kill them before they got there. And so we were the only we were a medical unit and the only troops in town, so we got arranged to get a couple infantry companies to come in and take over these German prisoners from the Russians and set up a stockade near the little town that we were bivouacked in. Well, our former battalion commander, Colonel Sanford, had been promoted shortly after we had been through Ohrdruf and made commanding officer of a MASH-type hospital. And he, the last big concentration camp the Americans liberated was at Ebensee, Austria, south of Salzburg. This was a very large camp. They had from 25 to 30,000 slave laborers in it at its peak, and there were still 12 to 15,000 still struggling to stay alive when the camp was liberated by the 101st Airborne and an infantry division and part of our 4th Armored Division. But Colonel Sanford's hospital was assigned immediately after this camp was discovered, near this little town of Ebensee, Austria, on the south of a beautiful lake in the foothills of the Alps. And they had been working in salt mines in the Alps in that part of Austria during the war. And Colonel Sanford had kept track of his whole unit, our unit, and sent word to us shortly after VE Day. He said, if you guys think we saw anything at Ordruff, try and arrange to come down and spend a couple days with me here. His hospital had been assigned to go into this camp with an infantry regiment. The infantry regiment was assigned to pilot digging up mass graves and stuff. They rounded up civilian work gangs to do that. And so shortly after VE Day, a few of us from our unit, his old unit, went down and spent a day with Colonel Sanford. And the pictures you have now are of Ebensee. This was the last slave labor camp liberated, and it was liberated by the Third Army. So our army had the distinction of liberating the first one, Ordruff, and the last one. They were dying at the rate of 100 to 150 a day of malnutrition, primarily malnutrition, beatings, and a lot of tuberculosis. So this was a terrible, the medical problem was to, of course, all those that had a fighting chance to be saved medically were they set up big tent hospitals and went to work to try and save those that had a chance to be helped medically. There were some so near death when they were rescued that it was just a matter of trying to give them a clean, more secure place to die a day or two later. But this was a tremendous problem medically. But in going through this camp, we went through barracks that was just the most shocking. As bad as Ordruff was there, they were all dead that we saw. But going through, I'll never forget the first barracks I went through with a group. There was a poor man struggled to come to the end of the filthy nest of unsanitary conditions he was living in, crawled over 2 dead bodies in his bed to get to the end of the bed, and speaking in English. As I remember, he was a college professor from one of the Balkan countries that had been in this camp for quite a while, and he was just skin and bones, but still spoke English quite well, and he just begging to be helped, of course, and we could just tell him that the medical people were getting him out of the barracks as fast as they could, and he would be helped as soon as they could get to him. But I'll never forget the shocking experience of this poor man in a filthy bed with two dead people right next to him. We had a mini reunion with our old colonel back in 1994, I think it was, 96. He had a son that was a microbiologist that had been hired by the Medical College of Wisconsin, and Colonel Sanford, my friend Fred Kirchhoff and I, we had maintained contact with him over there. He came back and started a family practice in Caldwell, New Jersey, where he was from New Jersey originally. A wonderful man, and we exchanged Christmas cards and would have a phone call once in a while, but he called us and said that his son had been transferred to Milwaukee, and he and his wife were going to come to spend a few days with him, and if we could get away, we'd have a little reunion. So we went and spent a couple of days with Colonel Sandy, and he, of course, I hadn't seen him since the day we were with him at Ebensee, near the end of the war, and he got a lot of information about. He ended up being there 6 weeks at that hospital before they had completed their work. They had saved an awful lot of lives, of course, but they unfortunately had to pilot the arranging to have cemeteries for all those that had died and were dying. But he loaned us a set of his pictures, so the pictures you're going to see now are pictures that he loaned us and we made copies of. This is one of the work gangs. They had mass graves there too. This one, of course, the infantry was assigned to pilot the civilian work gangs. These were some of the healthy ones that were able to get out of the barracks and be on the ground. This was one of Colonel Sanford's pictures. These were 4 Jewish doctors that had been in the camp a relatively short time, and they immediately volunteered to work with the American medical people, and Colonel Sanford said they made themselves extremely valuable fast and that they were all multilingual. And of course, one of the problems the Americans had working with so many of these poor people was language problems, but these said these doctors made themselves tremendously valuable to help the medical process. This was a picture of the gas oven. This is very standard equipment in all the camps. Burn about 8 to 10 bodies at a time. There's another picture of Colonel Sanford. I say these are so many of these poor people were so malnourished you didn't know if they were 30 years old or 70. This was a Catholic nun nurse in Austria that volunteered to Colonel Sanford's hospital group to help, and he said that she too made herself very valuable and that she was also multilingual. Of course, the communication problem was real difficult with some of these poor people. They literally worked and starved and beat these people to death. Now this was a horrible picture. This was an SS guard that, for some crazy reason, after the camp was liberated by the Americans, and these poor there are almost 15,000 living slave laborers in the camp that were now free. And this SS guard attempted to sneak back into the camp the night after it was liberated. The story they thought was that he had come back to try and retrieve some personal item that he wanted, and of course the newly freed slave laborers that he had made himself well known to, apparently they recognized him immediately as one of the brutal guards that they had been tortured by, so he was literally beaten to death and ended up in the morgue himself. After after the war ended, of course, we were in Austria awaiting our orders as to what we were going to be doing. We knew that we would be part of the occupation forces. Of course, Germany was divided up into 4 zones: the Russian zone, the American zone, the British zone, and the French zone. And the American occupation area assigned was essentially Bavaria and some of the adjacent territory to a beautiful part of Germany. It was a good hunk of Germany to be assigned to. But we were not sure for several days as to what our assignment was going to be. So while we were still waiting in Ried, Austria to find out what was going to happen next, General Eisenhower's headquarters had sent out orders to all Army units that now that the war is over, commanding officers were encouraged, in fact, almost ordered to arrange to let the soldiers get some time to go to interesting places to visit and so forth. Of course, Germany had a lot of beautiful areas to visit, and we ending up in Austria, of course, we're quite close. The big thing that immediately became of interest to go and visit was Hitler's Camp David at Berchtesgaden, where he had this tremendous mountain retreat area right on the German side of the Germany-Austria border. And so we, early in the VE Day was May 8th, and near the end of May, we arranged to have quite a few of our battalion headquarters group go down and spend a day at Berchtesgaden, which was tremendously interesting. There was the main retreat area where Hitler, Goering, and Bormann had their homes, beautiful big homes, and there was a hotel there and a SS barracks for the guards for the area, and they had a women's barracks near the SS barracks, and they had a nursery in the camp, and it was a real complete layout. And of course, it had this area. This was about 5,000 feet elevation in the mountains, but then they had built the Eagle's Nest on the top of the mountain, about 25,000 feet above this camp, where that's where Hitler and Mussolini and Tojo from Japan would have some of their world meetings. And but there had been a slave labor. We had been told that they had. I don't know what, 4,000 slave laborers digging a shaft through the mountains to build an elevator up to the Eagle's Nest at the top of the mountain from the main retreat area. Well, our Air Force from Italy had bombed the main retreat area, Hitler's home and Bormann's home and the hotel, and most of the barracks had been quite badly damaged. The only house that was fully intact was Goering's home, but we did go through part of Hitler's home, even though it was badly damaged. It was a massive structure, and underneath the home there was elevators that weren't available, of course, at that time, but because this is right after the war. But they had a complete underground survival city. We learned that said that 3,000 people could live underground there for a year or so. They had provisions stacked. It was a massive underground city there in the Alps, and Fortunately, it never was used. It became part of the tourist attraction later on. But we spent a very interesting day there. Remember going through Goering's home was the only one fully intact. Went through his house, which was a pretty fancy one. The bomb our Air Force from Italy had bombed this place just a few days before the war ended. And the bomb intended for Goering's house landed in his beautiful blue tile swimming pool. A little anecdote about our visit to, of course, they had this elevator that went from the main retreat area to the eagle's nest on top of the mountain. Well, it happened that the elevator was not working the day we were there, but there was an MP on guard at the gate to notify people the elevator wasn't working. And my friend and I visited with him a while, and he said that a couple days before we were there, General Eisenhower had come to view Berchtesgaden for the first time, and he, the commanding general of 7th Army, this was a 7th Army, this was their area of occupation, so he was in charge of the area and the camp, and this general was escorting Eisenhower, showing him Berchtesgaden, and they came to the elevator to go up to the eagle's nest, and there was a sign over the elevator use for field grade officers and above only. When Eisenhower saw that sign, he said, "Who the hell put up that sign?" And the general said, "Well, I authorized it to be put up because we got so many people coming here that there just very few could wait out getting on the elevator." And Eisenhower said, "The war is over. Take down that damn sign." He said, "This is a place for GIs to be touring." He says, "There's to be no rank here." And the MP said the group of GIs that were following the tour through the camp started cheering, and said the story quickly emerged that the difference between Eisenhower and MacArthur, if that had been MacArthur, the general would have been chewed out for not having it read generals only. But Eisenhower was a very respected and popular senior commander because he was pretty democratic. We ended up doing occupation duty in a little town of Turkheim, Germany, west of Munich. And our assignment, our battalion headquarters assignment, was to work with a couple German military hospitals that were in smaller cities near where we were located. And we, of course, they had an awful lot of wounded German soldiers from the Eastern Front and from Italy and from the Western Front, and they're comparable to our VA hospitals. And of course, their military casualties, we assumed some responsibility to make sure that the hospitals had the medical supplies they needed and so forth. So we had these two hospitals that we were responsible to work with and try and help them with anything that our mission was required to react to. Well, in this little town, there were several displaced people from other areas, both of Germany, and this little boy was a little Polish boy. He and his mother, their village in eastern Poland had been caught between the Russian and German fighting that came through that part of Poland, and they were hiding out in the basement of their little home in this town, I guess, and a artillery shell hit the house, and the father was killed, and the little boy had a leg blown off just below the knee, and he was, I don't know, 4 years old or so at the time, I guess. And he and the mother, through the underground, got farther into a safe area of Poland, and ultimately got into southern Germany with a group of refugees that lived there, and he and some of the little German kids and others would come around our headquarters because we'd give them candy and gum and a little food once in a while when we could, and had several of the little kids that stopped into. I was the battalion supply sergeant for our unit, so I had access to a little more gift stuff than some of the guys did. And so a lot of these little kids would come and see me quite regularly. And little Franz was had a crutch. He hopped around with crutches. He had a pair of crutches that his mother had arranged to get for him, and he. After I learned that one of the hospitals we worked with had a large prosthesis department, so I checked with his mother to see if she'd be interested in having me find out if I could get the Germans to make him an artificial leg. And of course she was pleased to have that happen. So I checked with them to see if they could take care of this little boy that had his leg blown off, probably by the Germans in Poland. And that wasn't their regular assignment, but they were quite responsive to American direction. And so they arranged to have me bring little Franz in, and they fitted him, measured him up, and made a wooden leg for him. So then I found a German tailor in the town and had him make him a suit, and this is one of the more satisfying and constructive things I did during the occupation. Right after the war ended, of course, we were all soldiers. We had about 9 million soldiers in Europe, the U.S. did. And of course, the Pacific War was, the Battle of Okinawa was started late in the summer. That was the last big area to be fought for and occupied before the invasion of Japan. And there were plans that we learned later to invade Japan sometime in December of 1945. Of course, I was 23 years old when the war ended, and single and no dependents at home. And the younger guys like myself, we were all informed not to plan on getting back to the States, because after things got settled down with the occupation assignments after the war the end of the war in Germany, we could anticipate being reassigned to new units in southern France to be trained and prepared for the invasion of Japan, which was scheduled for in December. And so we had that hanging over our heads all summer. So needless to say, when the big bomb was dropped and that ended the war in Japan, there was a tremendous spring of relief among a lot of young soldiers in Germany that hadn't planned on getting home. The older soldiers, any that had dependents, were informed that they would be the priority people to be recycled back to the States, but not to plan on getting out of the service yet. They'd be get a month furlough, and then they'd be reassigned to new units in camps in the States to be prepared for the invasion of Germany. So there was a tremendous armada planned. Patton was to be the commanding general of the group leaving from Europe through the Mediterranean and around India, and then there was a group to be another massive force from the western camps in our country and Hawaii and the islands for the invasion of Japan. But fortunately, the Japanese surrendered after the atomic bombs were dropped. So I finally got in the pipeline to come home in late October, early November of 1945, and by the way, it was transferred into. Of course, those of us in Germany were that as your eligibility came up for return to the States for discharge, we were reassigned into units, just processing units, where to be prepared to leave Germany and get into France and get assigned to boats to come home. So I was transferred into what turned out to be the part of the Japanese-American division that had fought in Italy, and one of their field artillery battalions had been transferred to the Third Army in Germany before the invasion of Germany, and so this unit became a processing vehicle for assembling about 500 of us to be processed to come home. So of course, I didn't know anything about the background of this Japanese-American unit until later, but there were still 10 or 15 of the original Japanese soldiers in that unit that I had the good fortune to work with for processing people to get us ready to get in the pipeline to come home. But they were the first Japanese people I had ever met. I had never met a Japanese person until that time. And but they were all volunteers, of course. Most of them were college graduates. They were from Hawaii and Southern California, and they volunteered to fight for America, and they were not they were not to be used in the Pacific Theater, understandably. Senator Inouye from Hawaii was part of this group that he lost an arm in Italy. They had a lot of casualties in Italy, but this one battalion became part of the Third Army for the invasion of Germany. And I had the good fortune to work with 10 or 15 of these original guys to help with the processing. And we finally got to Le Havre, France in mid-December, and got on a troop ship heading home just before Christmas in 1945. And the Atlantic, this is a rather small troop ship we were on. There were about 1,500 of us. And the Atlantic was very rough in December. We learned that. I remember out in the middle of the ocean, the captain announcing one morning that in the last 24 hours we made 22 nautical miles forward, and we made 1,000 miles up and down. Everybody was seasick, but no one was complaining because we were heading in the right direction. But we pulled into the New York Harbor just after Christmas in 1945, and was processed a couple of days in Fort Dix, New Jersey, and got on a train to Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. Was discharged in early January 1946, and started college under the GI Bill about 3 weeks after I got out of the service. So that's my story. And I might close with, when I come up to Century, I always feel I'm coming home. I worked for Century for 32 years, starting in Minneapolis, and been retired for 28 years now, so I've had 60 years of my life with Center Insurance. Wonderful company, and it's I'm just amazed at the tremendous crowd that has come to hear me tonight. I really, really appreciate your being here.